are you all?
Very good. Yourself?
Good. Forgiver's party. Snow helps in this year.
You can't do much without the plane.
What's that?
You can't do much without the plane.
Right.
We're all good here.
Good afternoon. I'm Bishop Demetrius Sinegal with Safe House Unmuzzled Advocacy Group, not-for-profit advocacy group that serves as a first line of defense for victims of gross clergy abuse within the African American church and against predatory sexual misconduct within the same, while advocating for legislation, reform, government programs. To do this, part of our focus is to protect and to defend and to restore victims of gross clergy abuse and predatory sexual misconduct. Paulo Freire said that washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. The recent marriage of the 63-year-old pastor of Christ Apostolic Temple, Dwight Reed, here in Des Moines, Iowa, to teenage, lifelong church member, former student, and upon information and belief, counseling recipient, Jordan Goodlett, has brought shame, embarrassment, and reproach upon the Apostolic Church Global. However, for your concern, it has brought shame and reproach to your community and seems to be a violation of Iowa code. The nation looks on in shock and dismay that such an overt and blatant abuse of a young teenage black girl is being permitted in an American city in 2022. When we begin publicly crying out against Dwight Reed's reprehensible use of his pastoral privilege to, upon information and belief, groom this adolescent for marriage, a myriad of witnesses began coming forward with first-person allegations of gross clergy abuse, predatory sexual misconduct, harassment, threats, acts of physical harm, violence, misappropriation of assets and funds belonging to the nonprofit church organization, and more. My team and I have ourselves been receiving threats of harm and threats on our life from those purporting to be parts of Dwight Reed's camp. Those witnesses that have come forward include one of Dwight Reed's oldest biological daughters, several of his family members, former elders from Christ Apostolic Temple, and countless lay members of the church. 1 Timothy 5:19 says that against an elder, we shouldn't receive an accusation without 2 or 3 witnesses. We, however, have more than 2 or 3 witnesses, a myriad of witnesses that testify against Dwight Reed's abuse of power. According to Scripture, this man is a wolf in sheep's clothing. There is an outcry of these citizens of your community, and their testimony is that this church has the makings of a cult, and that the time they spent there has negatively impacted their lives in indescribable ways. This is clearly a matter of social welfare and the subsequent impact of public health for your community. This is clearly a matter that your community has a responsibility to address. The state of Iowa's Attorney General's office conducted an investigation into clergy abuse primarily impacting the Catholic Church, a predominantly white church in your state whose victims were primarily white. We seek the same investigative concern into Christ Apostolic Temple, where a black teenager is now in what can only be called contracted abuse, a marriage to her abuser. A pastor and his members have a fiduciary responsibility in that the pastor is assumed to place the welfare and best interest of the member above all else, especially above his own interest. There is an assumed guarantee of non-exploitation that is woven into the tapestry of the pastor-member relationship. In such a fiduciary relationship, the member justifiably reposes confidence and trust, assuming the pure and well-meaning intentions of the fiduciary. No pastor with the welfare and best interest of his members would encourage a teenager to commit the best years of her youth to a man 43 years her senior. Iowa Title 16 Criminal Law, Subtitle 1, Chapter 709 says and defines a counselor or therapist as a physician, a psychologist, a nurse, a professional counselor, a social worker, marriage or family therapist, alcohol or drug counselor, and member of the clergy, or any other person, whether or not licensed or registered by the state, who provides or purports to provide mental health services. It goes on to define emotionally dependent as the nature of the patient or client's or former patient or former client's emotional condition, or the nature of the treatment provided by the counselor or therapist is such that the counselor or therapist knows or has reason to know that the patient or client or former patient or client is significantly impaired in their ability to withhold consent to sexual conduct as described in subsection 2 by the counselor or the therapist. I won't read the entirety of the statute, but I'll provide it to media that is here for your reading. It does go on to state that any sexual conduct with an emotionally dependent patient or client, or emotionally dependent former patient or client, for the purpose of arousing or satisfying the sexual desires of the counselor or therapist, or the emotionally dependent patient or client, or emotionally dependent former patient or client, list here that at best commits a Class D felony. Upon information and belief, Dwight Reed assumed the pastoral leadership of Christ Apostolic Temple among suspicious circumstances in 2017. Upon information and belief, in addition to assuming the leadership of the church, he also became overseer and dean of all the church's subsidiaries, including the J.W. Reed Christian Academy. Jordan Goodlett, a student there, would have been 14 to 15 years old during this time. It has been reported that he began showing her, quote unquote, special attention, providing counseling to her due to the difficulty she was experiencing from her parents' divorce. It is intellectually unintegral not to consider the marriage within the context of the nature of the pre-existing fiduciary relationship. In light of that, the marriage is in and of itself exploitative and abusive. His pastoral authority made it impossible for a relationship to be symmetrical between him and his now teenage bride. We contend that current avenues of redress do not clearly identify this behavior, and moreover sanitize language which softens the harsh truths about it, fail to capture the essence of wrong committed by this pastor. This deliberate breach of trust for self-gain, and the calculated way in which consent has been induced makes it impossible for this teenager's consent to be void of the influences of her abuser. Her manufactured consent to a marriage with her abuser makes it no less abusive and no less a violation of your state's laws. Even in situations where a parishioner, in particular a teenager, may appear to initiate inappropriate relationship and does not see oneself as a victim, it is a violation of pastoral ethics and seemingly your state's laws for the church leader to accept such advances. Because of the power imbalances, it is always the responsibility of the caregiver to maintain appropriate and ethical boundaries. Empirical evidence proves the negative mental and emotional affect of a marriage between a caregiver and a care recipient with 43 years between them. 2 of 3 of Dwight Reed's ex-wives state that he was physically, emotionally, and mentally abusive. We can only then imagine the type of conditions this teenage wife will now live under, having married a man who is her grandfather's contemporary. This marriage tears at the very fiber of the social constructs of the African American family. Children are taught to respect their grandparents' contemporaries, not to marry them. As of the penning of this missive, over 6,500 citizens have petitioned you on change.org/investigate Dwight Reed to investigate Dwight Reed. We're asking the Polk County and Des Moines law enforcement agencies, along with the state's Attorney General's office, to open an investigation into Dwight Reed, his marriage to Jordan Goodlett, the threats and harassment experienced by members that have spoken out against him, and what appears to be significant private annulment of Dwight Reed by Christ Apostolic Temple, a nonprofit organization. The complicity of the remaining members of Christ Apostolic Temple can only be explained by the years of conditioning they've undergone in the name of God through manipulative Bible teaching. Voltaire said, if you can lead people to believe absurdities, you can get them to commit atrocities. Though this marriage may be legal, the way it was formed is not. Furthermore, legal does not always mean ethical or moral. Not long ago, it was legal for black people in this nation to be bought, sold, raped, murdered. It was legal to prevent women from voting not long ago. Attached to this missive, this statement, are the names of clergy members, mental health professionals, researchers, community advocates, and college professionals and professors from across the United States of America that stand in holistic support of our condemning Dwight Reed's abuse of power and his marriage to his teenage church member. They stand in solidarity with us, though this statement is solely that, a safe house, unmuzzled advocacy group. We plead, we beseech, we insist that your municipality's law enforcement investigate Dwight Reed.
You taking questions, sir?
Sure.
What actions are you taking while you're in town toward these ends?
Sure. We have several appointments today with various law enforcement offices and officials to have reports filed. We have several meetings scheduled with some of your city's governmental officials, in particular those within that ward, who some, when we spoke with them, were unaware of these allegations and unaware what was going on.
You expressed some of this, but what outcome would make this a successful advocacy visit?
Well, first, raising awareness. To my understanding, with the exception of the column that came out last week in the Des Moines Register, this has not been a conversation that has been raised in media in this city. So number one, raising awareness. Number two, creating a climate of safety whereby these witnesses feel safe enough to come into these law enforcement offices to file their complaints. There have been some concerns concerning Dwight Reed and Christ Apostolic Temple's influence within the various departments in the city. And so our coming here is to ensure them that some precautionary measures have been taken to pave that way. And then finally, of course, tonight we'll be gathering here to meet with them and to worship and just to encourage them. There is a prevailing just sense of fear that surrounds this conversation. Even in speaking with one of the reporters from Channel 13 prior to coming, when I asked why had this not been a conversation yet in your local news media, and their response to me was, even in media, there's a measure of fear that surrounds this conversation. So we want to break down that fear factor that's there.
Have you ever spoken to Bishop Reed?
I have never spoken to him.
Mechanically, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but is there anything that can happen to change church leadership, or is that several steps down the road? Sure.
So, the government of this particular church, this is an independent church that's autocephalous in its government. Though there is a fellowship that Christ Apostolic Temple is the cathedral of, he is the presiding bishop. If we were talking about the Catholic Church, he's the Pope. And so he is the pinnacle of authority, and there is no presbyterial form of government, no other body of elders or deacons that could remove him. And so him being removed out of that church is really going to solely be the result of the members of that church leaving that church, so that there's no other church to pastor.
You talked about just because it's legal doesn't make it ethical.
Yes.
What about those that will say, well, this young 19-year-old has parents, family members that must have maybe signed off?
Sure. So her father walked her down the aisle. Her mother was not a part of it, was not complicit. However, her mother is herself recovering from her time in an abusive and manipulative spiritual culture, and is attempting to focus her energy on raising her two younger children. Jordan's grandfather, her paternal grandfather, joined us in one of our public clubhouse conversations and social media app that every Thursday night we host conversations surrounding clergy abuse. He came onto the clubhouse and emphatically condemned this marriage. Emphatically, his words were, and I quote, that her father sold his daughter out and pimped her out for his own self-gain. The family was not made abreast of this wedding except a day prior to. So the rest of the family was unable to get there. As I understand it, according to the information that has been given to us, the majority of those in attendance at this wedding were kids who were brought over from the J.W. Reed Academy to witness the marriage. So opportunity was not given. As it relates to, again, her own complicity, that has to be examined and considered within the context of the pre-existing relationship. Stockholm syndrome is a real thing, and its effects, both psychologically and psychosomatically, are real.
So you haven't talked to Mr. Reed or Mrs. Reed?
No.
But are you aware of the lawsuit, them claiming libel? And what do you have to say about them?
So I've heard about that online. I've not received any paperwork. I've not been served with that. I've not received this cease and desist letter that they have circulated online. So I'm unaware of it. However, if it were to come to that, again, no statement that we have made is without witnesses. I don't know these people. I have no relationship with them. This is my first time in Des Moines, Iowa. I have no personal inroad here. And so for me, if that is in fact what he has done, that will be to our benefit. It creates an opportunity for these witnesses who have been victimized to now have an audience in a court of law for their testimony to be heard.
I've heard the saying, obviously, threats to justice anywhere is injustice everywhere, but what does that say? You're not from here. So why does this even come on your map with the family? The dad walking her down the aisle? Are you coming from Texas to talk about this marriage?
Absolutely. Again, as an advocacy group, this is the kind of thing that we target and that we focus on. The African American church, in particular, the African American Pentecostal and Charismatic sect of the church, is a breeding ground for these types of abuses of power because there are not checks and balances. Something we see throughout the corpus of Scripture is that the work of prophets throughout Scripture were to speak truth to power and were to come into environments that they themselves had no roots in, where there may be a measure of fear over those who do, and to use their voice to confront that. God has given us a measure of influence in our aspect of the church. And I'm a believer that if you have power and if you have voice and platform, and you're not lending that to amplify the cries of the oppressed and the violated, then your power has been bestowed in vain. Thankfully, there are a couple of pastors in this city who are standing with us, and I trust that before we leave, that number will increase also.
You are a pastor. Can you explain a little further for victims how this affects their relationship with God and with churches?
Excellent question. So when a person is raised in this type of church culture, where God, faith, and church government is a part of the fabric of that person's worldview, and then they experience abuse within the context of that same environment that they have been reared to believe consciously and unconsciously as a safe space, and they experience the types of abuses that have been reported in this church, it literally alters global view and worldview. It changes meaning for them, their view of God, and not just their view of this church, but their view of the church at large. The church is Jesus Christ's idea. And so for me, as a bishop in the Lord's church, I've got responsibility to defend Christ's idea and to make it clear that this is a gross misuse of Christ's idea. Thank you all. Thank you. We'll give you all a copy of that statement and a list of these professionals that are standing in solidarity with us. Again, we appreciate y'all's patience waiting on us.
It's our weather that was the problem.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So thank you all for bringing the story.